Welcome to this podcast by the Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI, an international non-profit research and policy organisation that tackles environment and development challenges. With 8 centres spread across 5 continents, we connect science and decision-making to develop solutions for a sustainable future for all. This special mini-series focuses on the upcoming 28th UN Climate Change Conference, COP28. The episodes are based on the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation, and finance. I am your host, Katie Harris, Senior Policy Fellow at SEI. COP28 takes place at a pivotal moment in history when the world stands at a midpoint. 7 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, and 7 years to 2030 when it comes to an end. This podcast critically analyses our progress so far and poses the vital question: are we on track to deliver the ambitious goals of the Paris Accord by 2030? In the last episode, we discussed adaptation. So if you haven't listened to our conversation, I encourage you to go back and check it out. Today, we're talking about loss and damage and climate finance with 2 of our top experts on the topics. I'm delighted to introduce our guests, Zohar Shawu, scientist at SEI US, and Catherine Brown, research fellow at SEI headquarters. Welcome to the SEI studio. We know that equitable access to climate finance is absolutely imperative to drive climate action across all fronts: mitigation, adaptation, and of course, loss and damage. The UAE promises to deliver a COP this year with the highest ambitions and generate a pathway for real, tangible results. So let me turn to you, Katie, first of all. Do we have reason to believe this COP might be a catalyst for change? And what does our past track record suggest?
Sure. Thank you for the question. If I may, I might actually just start off by defining climate finance, because I think it's a word that we hear tossed around a lot, but perhaps it's not always clear exactly what we mean by it. So basically, climate finance is funding that goes to support climate action. And in fact, it can be funding that goes to support climate action anywhere in the world. But in the context of the UN, what we usually mean is funding that flows from wealthy countries to poorer and more vulnerable countries to enable their climate mitigation as well as their climate adaptation. So your question was, how ambitious is the COP going to be, and how is our track record? I think the track record is frankly not very good. I think if you know anything about climate finance, you probably know that there was a big commitment made in the Paris Agreement to what is it called, mobilize $100 billion a year for climate finance by 2020, and that commitment has not been met to date, though there is some speculation that it may be met this year. So that has caused a lot of distrust between parties, because in fact, that is one of the only solid commitments in the Paris Agreement. And the fact that it was not met by 2020, and in fact, it cannot be verified that it's been met by 2023, leads a lot of poorer and more vulnerable countries to distrust the wealthier parties that made that commitment. That being said, I think there are maybe some small signs for optimism. In particular, that goal may actually be met this year. The OECD, which is a group of wealthy countries, claims that it has been met, but we won't know for sure from the data for another couple of years. But still, it's a good sign that the gap is closing. I wouldn't say that it would completely rebuild the trust, but it will help. And there's also signs that perhaps we're moving closer to meeting commitments on adaptation funding, which have fallen short, particularly short to date. So that trust is starting from a very low point, but I think perhaps there are some signs that it's moving in the right direction at this COP.
Thanks so much, Katie. And I'll bring in Zohar into the conversation now. Zohar, you're our loss and damage lead here at SEI. Can you give our listeners just a quick 101, a lowdown on what the term loss and damage means, and talk us through its evolution up the climate agenda in recent years? And do you think its rise really suggests real breakthroughs are possible at this upcoming COP?
Sure. So loss and damage is typically defined as the impacts of climate change that cannot or have not been avoided through mitigation and adaptation. And to give an example, for example, if a flood occurs, you might have a loss of people's homes. You might have a damage to infrastructure, such as bridges being destroyed. You would have a loss of, people's agricultural land, which would impact their livelihoods. You would have mental health impacts on people. So all of these are losses and damages that people are already facing due to increasing climate impacts, particularly vulnerable communities in the global south. And so there has been an increasing demand over the years for financial support to enable these communities to recover from these impacts that they're already facing. Demand has existed for the past 30 years within the official UN system, with small island nations in particular calling for financial support to compensate for the sea level impacts that they are facing. Recently, it has gained increasing traction with some pretty devastating climate impacts, such as the floods in Pakistan that happened last year. And all of that has really contributed to momentum within the UN climate negotiations, and last year led to the agreement to establish a new fund or funding mechanism specifically for loss and damage, and for enabling countries to respond to the loss and damage that they are facing. This was considered quite a breakthrough, particularly for climate justice, because it gives legitimacy to the claim that global south countries and communities who have contributed the least to the problem of climate change are already suffering from its impacts, and so deserve some kind of financial support from global north countries who have contributed the most to then enable them to recover. So I do think that it is a breakthrough decision, but so far, no money has actually been put into the fund, and there aren't actually any funds on the table. So I think it's really to be determined how transformative such a fund can be in reaching the most vulnerable, and in actually providing adequate support to those facing loss and damage, particularly since estimates show that financial needs could be up to 500 billion US dollars per year by 2030 in developing countries alone, which is quite significant.
Great, thanks, Zohar. And I'd like to refer our listeners today to a previous podcast episode with Zohar on loss and damage for a more in-depth discussion of what the term means. And we will add the link to that episode to the description that you can see below. But thanks for giving us that very quick overview of to really define what loss and damage means, Zohar, and for charting its course throughout the last decades, really, its rise up the international climate policy agenda. So, Katie, can you chart a course for us on the broader climate finance landscape? What does it look like? Who funds climate action? And really what has happened since the Paris Accord was agreed back in 2015?
Sure. So there are a huge number of ways that climate finance flows from wealthy countries to poorer and more vulnerable countries. I think the most high-profile ways are the UN climate funds. So that would be things like the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. But there are a number of these funds. But these are actually relatively small in the overall landscape of climate finance. So I would say the largest proportion of fund flows through multilateral development banks, things like the World Bank, but also regional development banks, so the African Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank. And in fact, a large portion also flows bilaterally. So instead of through this multi-country system and these multi-country funds, it flows from one country to another. So say from Sweden to Kenya, just to give one example. And all of this is actually part of why it's so difficult to know whether we're meeting the $100 billion goal, is because it's flowing from so many different partners on different timescales and to accomplish different goals.
I guess I'd love to know a little bit about some of the more recent developments. So we've heard a lot about the Bridgetown Initiative. Can you explain to our listeners what this initiative is? And is it really that significant?
Sure. So the Bridgetown Initiative is a reform effort to basically alter the structure of the multilateral financial system to make it more just and more equitable, and to make it more aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So many of these multilateral institutions that I was talking about, so the World Bank as well as the International Monetary Fund, were set up in the wake of World War II, and they're called the Bretton Woods institutions for that reason. And these institutions were established by the world powers at the time, so the victors of World War II. And many countries have long argued that they tilt the financial system in a way that favors the interests of these countries. So people think in particular of the United States, but also European powers. And they also have long argued that these systems saddle poorer countries with unsustainable debt levels, and do not respect their national priorities for their own development. So this is a long-standing issue, and has long been a point of contention in the international system, but has gotten a lot of traction more recently. And I think the reason for that is actually mostly one person, who is Mia Mottley, who is the Prime Minister of Barbados. And at COP26 in Glasgow, she gave a speech that addressed many of these issues, and it developed a lot of momentum, somewhat surprisingly. I mean, at least for me, I was surprised to see, because these issues are longstanding, some new energy behind it. But to her credit, she really harnessed that momentum and went to a number of powerful leaders, powerful countries, and said, okay, if you're serious about this, let's make some changes. Let's put some things on paper. And so at a meeting in Bridgetown, they articulated a number of reforms that they would like to see around reducing debt burdens, around addressing loss and damage, also around eliminating subsidies for fossil fuel development, particularly under the World Bank. And I think, as I said, there's a lot of political momentum around these ideas, but there's also a lot of inertia in these institutions. So they are longstanding, and they're very slow to change. They're very resistant to change. And in some cases, they're very insular, especially I think people think the World Bank and the IMF are much more isolated from civil society scrutiny than the UN is, for example. So I think that, as I said, there's a lot of momentum building behind this, but it's not clear if that's going to translate into tangible change. And in particular, it's not clear if it's going to change anything within the UN process. So there's a lot of momentum around changing the World Bank and the IMF and the regional development banks, but it's not quite clear how it connects to the COP. So for me, going to the COP, I'm interested to see how that could translate into the agenda, into the actual negotiations, and into larger discussions about like the new climate finance goal, for example, that will come into effect in 2025.
Just one more follow-up question for now. So you've mentioned that our past track record on delivering on our promises on climate finance is not a shining one. And that there are a lot of challenges that the Bridgetown Initiative has to overcome, including the inertia of the global financial architecture. And we know at the same time that countries with the greatest financing needs are also those that are experiencing or at the highest risk of experiencing the impacts of climate change. Is equitable access to finance, to climate finance, really practical and achievable in the near future?
I actually think that it's not important whether it's practical. I think that There are, of course, difficulties in altering the financial architecture, and there are a number of challenges in coming up with public funding to support the most vulnerable populations. But I think we've seen examples lately where there was a sense of urgency around mobilizing funding. And I'll give the most recent and obvious one, which is COVID, which is that money materialized so quickly to support COVID initiatives in all over the world. And now we see many wealthy countries saying, well, they'll literally say, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel. We're doing everything we can to try to meet that $100 billion goal. And I think that it's not very persuasive, to be honest, when you see that when there is a more direct sense of threat to wealthy countries and to their interests, that suddenly money is not so difficult to find. And I think that when it comes to climate finance and climate change, actually the threat is just as direct, but it's just a matter of perception that we don't perceive it as quite as urgent. And I think that that's to their own fault. And I think that's at the root of the distrust. And I think another example would be the war in Ukraine, that when we feel threatened, suddenly it's not so difficult to come up with the money. And so, like, to me, the reasonableness, the practicality argument is quite weak because I think the money is there and it's more a matter of to whose interest it's being deployed. I do think also to the same end that it is achievable. I think the $100 billion goal has well been achievable for a while. And in fact, we're thinking on a completely wrong scale. And I think that, as I mentioned, they're now debating what a new goal will look like in 2025. And I think we're going to talk about, a whole nother quantum, like a whole nother level of commitment. And it's needed. That in fact, 100 billion is well short of what we need and has long been achievable. And it's the political will that has been lacking.
And I'm going to bring Zohar back into the conversation. And you mentioned at the beginning of this episode the fact that COP27 ended with this landmark agreement to establish a new loss and damage fund to enable vulnerable countries to respond to and recover from the climate impacts they are facing. Can you give us a few more details on what is the current state of the fund? Has there been any progress since that landmark decision at COP27? And we hear a lot about operationalization of the fund, but what does this actually mean in practice?
Yes. So when the fund was established, there was also the agreement to put together a committee consisting of primarily negotiators and technical experts from both wealthier and poorer countries to basically discuss how the fund could best be operationalized. And that committee has met a few times, 3 times this year, to discuss different aspects of the fund, such as, how would it be governed, what activities would it cover, who would pay into it, who would receive funds from it, and so on. I would say, to be honest, that progress or discussions have been quite slow moving and disappointing and quite charged with political tensions between wealthier and poorer countries, which have undermined some of the more technical discussions that need to happen about, what is the best and most effective way for the fund to function to actually reach the communities that are most in need. Conversations have really focused on things like who are the most vulnerable countries that should be eligible to access funding, which in itself is contentious. Should it only be the smaller and most conventionally vulnerable countries, or should larger developing countries also be able to access funds? Who should be paying into the fund? Should it only be conventionally wealthy countries, or should countries such as China or Saudi Arabia also be contributing to the fund? There are also disagreements regarding the scope of the fund. Will it fund everything under loss and damage, all damages and losses faced, or will it focus on specific aspects? Will it focus only on impacts relating to slow onset events like sea level rise or desertification? Will it focus only on non-economic losses and damages, such as impacts to cultural heritage or psychological support? And what could other things be covered through other mechanisms, such as humanitarian aid or development finance, for example? So I think there's a lot of contention really around what loss and damage actually means, where the largest gaps are, and where the fund would fit in the overall architecture and what it will fund. I think other points of disagreement also relate to which actors specifically would be able to access funds. And here we see civil society in particular advocating for local NGOs and non-governmental actors, particularly being able to access funds, such as community-led organizations and grassroots groups, to make sure that finance reaches the most vulnerable populations on the ground itself. But conversations between negotiators have mainly focused on governments being able to access the funds. And then, of course, there are questions around, how can we make sure the fund doesn't replicate the same problems and challenges of existing climate finance, which Katie was outlining before, related to accessibility and debt burdens. So, how do we make sure that finance for loss and damage is primarily grants-based so that it does not exacerbate the debt burdens of countries? How do we make sure that it has lower accessibility requirements so that it doesn't take several years for countries to put together proposals to be able to access the fund? And, basically, how can it be designed in a way that is more aligned with climate justice principles, and takes into account that people are in an emergency state and there's like a certain urgency in receiving funds, and doesn't really put the burden of proof on vulnerable communities to be able to meet a lot of requirements to be able to then access funds. So a lot of these questions are still up in the air at the moment.
Thanks, Soha, for giving us a really good overview of some of the main points of contention that are sort of blocking operationalization of the fund, or further agreements on how the fund will work in practice. And I know as part of your research, you have been collecting views, more in-depth views from prospective funders and also recipients of loss and damage finance. And I'd love to just hear a few thoughts on what you found. Can you share any other insights with us? Can you summarize their perspectives that they may be bringing to the COP28 negotiations?
Yes, I can share a few recommendations based on our research for how we think the fund should best be operationalized. The first is really that it should adopt alternative eligibility requirements, and countries that do not have the capacity to meet accessibility requirements are often the most vulnerable, and so should not be left out. So you could have lower access requirements for smaller countries or those with low capacity or conflict-prone areas. You could have lower due diligence requirements for organizations that are already accredited to access funds or already able to access funds. We also suggest that there should be a specialized window, like a small grants window, for example, that is specifically accessible for local NGOs and grassroots organizations, and that there should be funding support for capacity building to actually enable those local NGOs to access funds themselves and to be able to really manage the funds that they receive themselves, so that they have significant autonomy and decision-making power in determining how loss and damage finance is utilized. Another key point is, of course, that finance should be largely in the form of grants rather than loans, and also that it shouldn't necessarily be conventionally, the conventional project-based model of finance, where you have a certain amount of funds for one project and then the project ends and then you move on, which is how conventionally climate finance works. We say that loss and damage, the impacts are ongoing and continuous, and the need for recovery is a very long process that takes several years of rebuilding and getting livelihoods back on track. And so we argue that finance should be more, long-term and flexible, and in the form of, for example, direct budgetary support to governments, so that they don't have to deliver on specific project requirements, but can use the funds according to their own needs as the realities on the ground keep changing, as they're continually facing loss and damage impacts. I already mentioned the importance of finance to reach the local level through channeling it through local NGOs, but even through governments, you could have specific requirements for governments to have community engagement processes which could be integrated in, the proposal requirements for the funding. You could, require a certain percentage of the funding to be dedicated to reaching the local level, for example. Similar to that, I think it's really important for the fund to have participatory and representative decision-making processes. For example, you could have CSO representatives or representatives of vulnerable groups on the governance structure or the board of the fund itself, so that they have a say in what it looks like, and make sure there's equitable decision making so that the countries that are facing the majority of climate impacts have more of a say in how funds are utilized.
What do you think will happen if they don't reach agreement at the COP? Because you've said process like this year has been very slow. There's been some foot dragging. Like, if we get to the COP and they aren't able to operationalize this fund, what happens?
I think it's interesting because wealthier countries have actually been using this argument of there's a lot of urgency. We need to operationalize the fund as quickly as possible, which is a little counterintuitive, but it's really because it serves in their interests to diminish the fund, right? And to make it something that is small, that fits into an existing fund that could sit under something like the World Bank, and that's easy to put together, like to fit into existing structures. Which would really diminish its value as a separate entity that is dedicated to loss and damage, that covers a whole spectrum of losses and damages. And so their approach of urgency, mobilize, like put together something quickly, could actually lead to something that is not as impactful and is pretty small scale in the end and is diminished in value. So developing countries have actually been, arguing for, maybe it's worth it to take, they've already waited 30 years for this fund to exist, right? So maybe it's worth it to wait another couple of years to establish something that is grounded in climate justice principles, that is well thought through and can exist as a separate entity that is dedicated to loss and damage, which would really be a win for the legitimacy of their concerns, right? So in my opinion, I think if we don't reach agreement at the COP, I don't think it's the end of the world. But I think that it is important in the meantime to have funds on the table, right? I think that I would be quite disappointed if we go to the COP and we don't have any pledges from developed countries for finance for loss and damage, either through the fund or even bilaterally through other avenues, right? Because we do know that we can't necessarily wait several years for this fund to exist because communities are already facing loss and damage impacts and urgently require support. And so if you could have funds provided bilaterally or through existing initiatives in the meantime as well, in addition to focus on operationalizing the fund, that would be quite welcome.
Katie, I'd like to ask you a question now. So many of the propositions Zoha has outlined as being important for governments and parties to take into account when negotiating how this loss and damage fund should work, are drawing lessons from what has worked less well in terms of climate finance and that climate finance landscape more broadly. So how can developing countries be financially empowered to build resilience to the climate crisis, not only in terms of the losses and damages they are incurring, but in terms of their needs for adaptation and for climate change mitigation as well? Do you think we need a series of incremental changes? Do you think we need major reforms and innovations of the global financial architecture? What do you think needs to happen?
To start backwards in your question, incremental changes are not going to do it because climate finance is very far from where it needs to be in terms of effectiveness. And I think that what we need to be transformed is the ownership over the finance. So right now, the way that, and this is part of what the Bridgetown Initiative is trying to address, the way that climate finance is flowing, it is largely flowing in the interests of those who give it. And I think what we're seeing is that means that on the ground, it's not working because it's either responding to the needs of those countries or their frameworks, their ways of looking at climate change and looking at mitigation and adaptation. And it's definitely not responding to the needs of local communities who are adapting in wildly different contexts that perceive risks in very different ways. And of course, are trying to balance adapting to climate change with continuing to meet basic development needs in many contexts and address fundamental aspects of well-being. And so I think what we need in the architecture is for climate finance to flow in a way that gives control over that funding and what is done with it to the countries, and not just the countries, but local level communities and organizations to make decisions about it. And I think that there's this. I know less about mitigation than adaptation. And I think adaptation is actually the harder problem, because with mitigation, we can say what's working and not working because there is one unit of what is effective. And is that, are we reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide? Whereas with adaptation, it's wildly different. There are wildly different baselines. There are wildly different priorities. And we're not going to know whether it's effective 10, 20, 50 years from now, because the changes are going to come in a way that it's very difficult to know right now what will be effective. And so I think there's this shift within adaptation and within adaptation finance to say what we really need to be doing is empowering people to make their own choices about what they see as their own resilient futures, as their own adaptation outcomes, and enabling them to make choices that they see as having value. And so I think that this is the transformation that we really need in the architecture, is to sort of flip it upside down from what it is right now.
I would like to ask you, Katie, since you've emphasized this need for country ownership and self-determination by countries and communities in utilizing funds, how do you balance that with safeguarding and making sure that funds are not misused in countries?
Yeah, I think that there's an inherent tension there. And a lot of my research has looked at that. And I think that if we have to choose between the two of them, that we choose the national ownership and the local ownership. And we accept that there's going to be some misuse, and some of it may be outright fraud, and some of it may just be maladaptation or poor usage of the funds. But if we're talking about urgency, it is more important, in my opinion, to get the money where it needs to go than to be overly hung up on the fact that it may not be perfectly implemented. And I'll make one other point, which is that it's not like the countries that give this money are, flawlessly executing democracy and, are themselves free of, misuse of funding and fraud. And I think that going back to the Bridgetown Initiative, that's part of the point that poorer and more vulnerable countries are making, is that it's a little bit patronizing to tell them that they're going to misuse the funds if we're not perfectly adhering to your frameworks and checking all your boxes. And so I think there is a trade-off, and we have to recognize that trade-off. But if we have to choose between them, we should choose towards, national and local ownership of the funding and what to do with it.
I'd like to ask you both just one more question. So Zohar on loss and damage, Katie on climate finance more broadly. What do you think COP28 must deliver in this space to build trust and to effectively support, in terms of finance, climate action around the world? So what discussions and agreements are needed to deliver on those ambitions that we set in the Paris Agreement 7 years ago, that we only have 7 years left to fulfill?
I think I already mentioned what I see as pretty critical is having funds on the table and wealthier countries coming in with pledges for loss and damage finance. I think that's something pretty tangible that the COP should deliver. In terms of negotiations on the fund itself, I think for me, I think the process of deciding on what the fund should look like is as important as the end goal itself. And I think the process itself needs to be equitable and inclusive as much as possible. So I would hope that going forward, not just at the COP, but beyond, there's an active effort to listen to the communities that are already facing these losses and damages, to listen to their needs, to have agreement to actually conduct needs assessments to figure out, who are the most vulnerable, what are the damages they're facing, and how can you actually actively implement activities that best serve their needs and priorities rather than coming in with a pre-existing notion of how we think loss and damage should be addressed. So I would hope that whatever agreements emerge out of the COP also allow for that kind of iterative approach. I think, we don't necessarily need to have something that is perfect and set in stone from the beginning, but I do think that there's a lot of value in this kind of piloting approach where, you try something out, but you leave things flexible and open enough that allows for significant input from communities on the ground, that allows for their own autonomy and decision-making power to be exercised. So I think most of all, what we need is a shift away from, serving country interests, developed versus developing, who will benefit from the fund, this kind of discussion, and move away and actually think about, the urgency of people already facing impacts and what do they need and how can we move in a way that accounts for that urgency and deliver support to them as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think from the climate finance side more broadly, I don't expect any major breakthroughs at this COP. I think that will be next COP where they decide on a new goal. But I think that what we need to see is baby steps towards rebuilding trust. So like building trust is hard and rebuilding trust is even harder. And I think that the two things that we can see at this COP that will start to rebuild the trust is the evidence or some preliminary evidence that the $100 billion goal has been met this year. Better 3 years late than never. And also that they're closing the gap on adaptation funding, because adaptation is particularly important to global South countries and to developing countries who are already seeing horrific impacts. And so I think what happens in the negotiation rooms and what comes out on paper is significantly less important than meeting the commitments that were made, nearly 10 years ago now. And that's the most important thing for moving forward with climate finance.
That's all for today's episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the podcast, share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To learn more about SEI and to access more resources and materials, head over to SEI.org and follow us on Twitter at SEI Research. Let's connect on the next episode. Thanks for listening.